All right, we're live again. Sorry for that little delay there. Looks like the screen wasn't shared and then the internet went out for some reason. I think I'm gonna have to get the paid version of this because I should be coming up on some limitations. All right. Anyway, so the interesting thing about today is going to be talking about how to simplify your analysis of master games and your own games. And we're going to start with this puzzle here. Now, I want you to think about the question of does it make sense? So, the reason I'm talking about this today specifically is that I realize when you're analyzing a game, you might say, oh, the master made this move and it doesn't really make sense, but it's the right move. But that's really the wrong way to look at analysis. What you want to ask is, does it make sense to you? Can you follow a logical thought line or thought process that leads you to those moves? Because the whole purpose of the chess moves is that they make sense to you. And you'll see masters, they make these moves and they'll say, okay, well, that doesn't really make sense to me, but a master is making the move. Well, obviously, that move makes sense to the master playing it. So, what you should try to figure out is how you would rationalize it. All right, so I chose this puzzle specifically because it's a rather simple calculation, but what you want to follow is the evaluation at the end of the line. Now, this is where you can go wrong with puzzles by doing a calculation, figuring out the right moves, but basically missing the whole point of evaluating the end line. So let's start with what you would look at. You'd look at checks, obviously. So queen check, and then the king would go over. You check again. The king comes here. Now you take because the rook was threatening your queen. The king is forced to go here because the pawn and the knight are covering here. And then you would see a knight check. So let's make those moves. All right. So basically, that's the right solution. Takes. All right. Then you're going to check. He goes here. All right. So you check. He moves, and then you take the queen. All right. That's so it looks like the puzzle is over at that point. Now, this is where you still want to practice evaluation and see if you get the correct one. Because obviously, you take the queen, but you'd still be down material, or at least it would be rather unbalanced material position. All right, so you take the queen, two rooks, and three minor pieces versus a queen, a rook, and two minor pieces. So what you do is you just subtract a rook for rook, minor piece for piece. Now, I would say that it's rather unclear even in this position because if you take the queen, he basically for a queen he has a rook and two minor pieces, and it looks like that could be somewhat unbalanced. And you do have these pawns here that can make a run for it, but it might be hard to do that considering the fact that he still has the two rooks. So even though you solve this position, you still need to look at the fact that the evaluation is going to be a lot more difficult in a game. Now, this would be a position where you'd actually want to try to play it against a computer, I would say. So obviously, the computer is saying this is one because it's a puzzle, but for a human, it might be a little more difficult. What is that? Oh, okay, so let's say so he goes back, takes. Let's see. I'm not sure why this isn't moving. Resume practice. Okay. All right. So it's saying -8, but again, we're practicing our evaluation here. So can you win this here? Let's see. If you can win a piece, then it would be pretty clear win. Okay, so that might be the final point. I would say they really should have played that here. Computer thinking. He takes. All right, so this is a lot more clear, especially since you have the rook threatening to pin there. You could just go something like there. Yeah, he's going to bring the rook in. But this isn't so clear as you would think. All right, he might bring the rook up. Let's see how he can win it. Got to be careful here. He's threatening a fork. All right, this is getting a little off my main topic, but I just wanted you to think about basically asking, does it make sense? Now, let's get away from this puzzle and go to a game that I was looking at and see how this applies. Okay, let me find this here. Go back, share, stop screen. All right, we're going to look at a Bobby Fischer game. I just got to pull this up here. Here we go. So this was a game that was played in 1966. Where did it go? Okay, I got to pull up. Yeah, this was 1966 between Bobby Fischer and Samuel Reshevsky. Trying to get this whole game so I can see the chat as well as this thing. All right, here we go. All right, so let's start from the beginning. So this is, let's see, is that big enough? Leave a comment if it is. I can make it bigger. But I still want you to see this here. So this is a game that obviously Bobby Fischer outplayed his opponent through the whole game. But when you start looking at a game like this, you can learn a lot by simply asking, does it make sense to you? And from there, you'll lead to other moves to see if they make sense. And then you'll go back and check it with the computer. So let's see how this would work in practice. So we're white, Bobby Fischer's white, Reshevsky's black. And this is otherwise a pretty perfect game played by Bobby Fischer. But it appears that otherwise, he's really not doing anything special. And I know I've said that before in other videos. But okay, so he's developing. That makes sense to me. Developing a piece. He's playing a Sicilian line. All right, so looks like black is, or the computer is suggesting there. All right, we get the Scheveningen, it looks like. Now, okay, so G4, right? It appears really aggressive. I know this is a line, but normally I wouldn't play this. I would play something like bishop to E2 or bishop to C4 or even bishop check. So this is where you make a note of these moves when you're analyzing a game and see if they make sense to you. So G4 can make sense. And now this is where you want to think about, does it logically make sense in terms of how you'd play? Now, G4, it's a good idea because it looks like he's pushing a pawn, and he could still castle queenside and start an attack on the king side. But there's two negatives to it. And just because Bobby Fischer's making the move doesn't mean you shouldn't think about these negatives, because this is how you'll prevent blunders in your own games. So the two negatives is basically that he's making a pawn move instead of developing move, and he's also weakening his king side. So these are two positional concepts that you should think about in terms of, does this make sense in terms of my thought process? Now, this is where I think a lot of chess players learn chess backwards, where first they'll learn a bunch of positional concepts. They'll learn weak files, ranks, weak king, pushing pawns, weaknesses. But the problem with that is that it's not basically thinking about how this makes sense to you on every single move, because chess is not just a discombobulated series of positional concepts that you try to apply in a game. It's more a conversation saying, okay, you make this move, I made that move. You made this move, I made that move. And the whole purpose is it needs to make sense to you. So that's what I'm trying to get across in this. And I really thought about, like, I don't feel like I do anything special when I play, but even when I play on Lichess, or when I played in tournaments, I guess my rating in terms of the statistics of it is basically in like the top 5%, the top 2% of players. And I always thought about how can players play simply and effectively, to get at least to the top 10% of chess players. Why do 90 or 95% of chess players not play the way I do, or the way a master does, when to a master, playing against the 2000 might seem simple? Why does it seem simple? And that's what I'm trying to talk about in this video today, and basically my whole channel. But all right, so black goes there. Now, you could play bishop to G2, or you could just take the pawn. That's what Bobby Fischer does. He takes. Now, I would look at something like bishop to g2 or bishop here, and you really should look at those moves. So they make perfect sense. Let's turn on the computer here. All right, so as you can see, it's good to check right away. All right, so the computer is actually suggesting a check, which obviously I missed that. I should have said bishop to b5. But bishop to g2, you always want to check every move that you look at that makes sense to you through a master game. This is how you can really, really learn a lot apart from solving puzzles. So bishop g2 make perfect sense to me. It's not a blunder. It's solid. Bishop to d2 as well. Okay, so let's go back here. Let's turn all these arrows off. All right, so Bobby Fischer does play bishop check. He takes. All right, so Reshevsky could have played a little more dynamically by taking the bishop. And then he checks, queen up. All right, so these all make sense. He's just trying to still develop, gets his queen off the rank, takes. Now, I probably would have just castled queenside. Now, mind you, this is a Bobby Fischer game, so you should be learning a lot, from each game you study from him. But it doesn't matter how good the player is. If it doesn't make sense to you, you're really not learning anything because you won't be able to apply it in your own games. Now, every single move, you have to make a decision, and that decision has to make sense to you. So castling queenside would make sense here to me. Other moves, possibly f4, or even castling kingside. Now, castling kingside looks a little crazy, but it does make some sense because Black is probably not going to castle queenside. He has these pieces here, the open F file or the open C file, sorry, and then he's going to play bishop here and then castle. So you could still play castle here. You have enough pieces. Although he does have this weak G4 pawn, you could still move the king and have an idea like that. So, all right. So let's go back actually and look at that real quick. All right. So again, that's not in the top moves here. Castling queenside. Bishop takes, knight takes. All right, so obviously that made sense to me somewhat, but this is where you go to the other side, saying if something made sense to you, but it's obviously wrong, then where in your thought process did you go wrong? So I would say the generalization here is that the king side is too weak because he played g4. So look at your previous moves as well, or the previous move in a master game, and ask if that move made sense, why doesn't it make sense now? If it makes sense to you in the current position, for example, castling kingside is what I'm talking about, it doesn't make sense because of the previous move g4. All right, let's keep moving. So he takes. All right, I really like this move. Still castling queenside. So it does seem I have a tendency to always just try to castle and complete my development. So maybe that's somewhat of a weakness of mine, where I'm not looking for total dynamic opportunities. Now, this is how you can really learn about your own habits in chess too. And that's one thing I've noticed about myself is when I'm playing a game, especially against a stronger player, I'll always kind of focus on safety instead of looking at counter chances earlier in the opening or the middle game. And I've missed a lot of opportunities because of that. Okay, so you can see that we're not just learning positional concepts, we're really getting to the heart of what your chess habits are and really what your weaknesses are in a game. All right, so he plays bishop to g7. Now, you would ask, why didn't he protect that pawn? Well, if the queen comes up or the queen tries to protect that pawn, then there's actually a tactic I could see here. He could still take. And now if he takes, then there's actually a knight fork. So that's basically why he ignored that threat. Again, so basic tactics, basic calculation, you can really reinforce both positional concepts and tactical concepts in the realm of trying to make sense of the chess moves that are going on. All right, so castles, finally. He takes. And it looks like white has a plus 1.2 evaluation. Now, this is really where computers make chess analysis a lot more helpful nowadays, because you can really get a very accurate numerical evaluation compared to some master saying, well, this is correct, and this is my evaluation. You can really get an exact evaluation, whether it's +3 or +4 or just +1. So +1 is obviously just the pawn, but positionally, all right. So I was going to say, why didn't he fork here? It looks like he had a fork, but actually, tactically, that probably doesn't work because here and then queen goes to, I guess that, let's see, queen there and then knight. Okay, how does this work tactically? Or then he goes, okay, then he goes queen to c6 most likely. All right, so he reinforces it, hits the knight. All right, that's a weird move. So he's just threatening, protects. All right, so knight to d6 makes sense to me because he's obviously just keeping his knight active. But also, he could have probably brought the knight back here, would have been fine. Now, you can also look at your opponent's moves too. This is where it's starting to go weird. All right, that's not the move, knight to d6. So why is the queen coming over here? He's obviously threatening the g4 pawn, but it looks like he's making some mistakes here because he's making his queen less active, and he's just kind of abandoning the center. So obviously you should look for your opponent's mistakes. So f3 is both defending g4 and protecting h2. All right, now white just completely owns the center. So that was a pretty bad mistake, actually. He just completely gave away the center. Maybe he just resigned himself. Takes. All right, he gave away another pawn, or I guess a trade. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so in the game, he made something that makes he made a move rook to d7. That makes sense. Looks like he's going to try to own the 7th rank. But actually, the computer is suggesting queen to d4. Now, when you have these kind of somewhat equal positions, or where you suddenly seize the initiative and you're getting an attack, this is where you want to be really careful about your understanding of what makes sense to you and what doesn't. Because this is really where you can make a blunder, where you start an attack that's not sound, and you can learn a lot from these specific positions. So, especially with the computer. So, let's actually see what the idea is behind queen to d4. So, queen to d4. Obviously, he doesn't want to go f6, although it's saying you can play that. But that gives white a big advantage because now he's going to really own the 7th rank. He goes back. Ah, very interesting. Okay, so the computer can really give you a lot of ideas in these kind of positions. So see, this is something that I never would have thought of. So check, and actually the check is not necessarily to start an attack. It's to play c4 and then try to run this pawn down. So these rooks are connected, but they're really not very active. So his idea would basically be to move the king over, bring the rook here, and then he has the queen, the rook controlling completely the center, just completely ignoring the king attack, and then get a passed pawn, which he already has. So that's a very interesting idea. All right, so let's see what he does. Makes a tactical mistake. All right, so after a couple moves, let's evaluate the material situation. Notice that the queen, let me get rid of these arrows. The queen is defending this pawn. White is otherwise a pawn up, though. And it looks like if he can win one more pawn, then he'll be in a really good position. Although it's only +2, it's still somewhat difficult. All right, so these are the kind of positions where you still have heavy pieces that you're really going to just basically make moves to try to check and try to get position versus really making attacks. You just make simple attacks, and this is another thing that makes sense to me in these kind of positions. So when you have a position like this, simple attacks with heavy pieces, and then trying to prevent your opponent from winning pawns. Now it looks like let's see, it looks like Reshevsky's going to fail this because he has the queen and the rook. White's queen and rook are bearing down on this, and he also has this pretty disparate pawn over here. So it looks like Fischer's going to win an extra pawn and be able to secure that. All right, he just makes some waiting moves. That's a blunder. check. All right. All right. So there's the pawn that he wins, and then the game is over. All right. So basically, Reshevsky resigned. Now, of course, this pawn is if this pawn wasn't here, he might have a chance to get a draw. But because this pawn is there and the heavy pieces are still on, he's going to be able to usher in a pawn with no problem. So a very interesting game that looks pretty basic, but of course, there's a lot of moves that could be very unclear. All right, so hopefully this makes some sense. I know this is a complicated topic because you're talking about what makes sense to you, and everybody has a different chess level. I understand that, but really you can do this at any level. Let's say if you're 800, maybe I'll do that in the next video. I'll play some really low rated players like 800 to 1200, and we'll go through and see how you could apply. Does it make sense? And just very simple ideas that can be very strong in practice. All right, thanks for following along, and I'm going to post another puzzle here either today or tomorrow, and I'll hopefully see you again either tomorrow or on Friday. Bye-bye.